we're in a huge hole. Horrific. All this is going to collapse. The dollar is going to lose its reserve currency status.
Are we headed towards a recession that's going to be worse than 2008?
I think so. In fact, I think we're actually in recession. By the time they write the history books on this era, it may be considered a depression. I think that the numbers that we get from the government are not accurate by design. So I don't really think that the economy is growing in any real sense. The way they compute the numbers, I think, is deceiving. For most Americans, their standard of living is declining. I don't think the economy is really getting bigger. I think we're spending more, we're borrowing more and going deeper into debt. We're paying more for everything we buy. And a lot of that consumption ends up feeding into the GDP. And so we get a bigger GDP number and we think, oh, that means the economy is growing. But I think it's all being distorted by the inflation and the debt. Meanwhile, individuals that are living in the economy are struggling. Their cost of living is going up. You have a record increase in the number of people holding multiple jobs, not just 2 jobs, but 3 jobs or more. And they still can't make ends meet. You've got record credit card debt, which is now over $1 trillion, first time ever. And we almost have $2 trillion in student loan debt. I mean, that has just exploded. And all sorts of debt. If we really had a growing economy, people would be getting out of debt. That's what happens when you're doing well. You pay off your debt. You build up your savings. The savings rate has collapsed in the last couple of years. That's not a sign of economic strength. That's desperation. People are tapping into whatever savings they have left just to make ends meet. We have record budget deficits. If times were good, the government would be running smaller deficits. They would be collecting more taxes. They wouldn't be spending as much on, government assistance. Our trade deficits are at record highs. If we had a booming economy, we'd be making more stuff. We'd be exporting that stuff, or we'd be importing less because we would just consume what we produced ourselves. But our economy is really shrinking. And that's why we're on life support. We're dependent on foreigners for all the goods that we can't produce. And we have to pay for it on credit because we don't have the real incomes or the savings to afford it.
The economy works in a certain way. There are physics to it. So what is it that you see that makes a recession or depression happening now or inevitable? What do you see that they're missing?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think we're in a depression now as far as the economic conditions. I said that by the time the historians look back on this time period, this could be the beginning of that depression, because I think the depression is in our future, really not in our past. And the way we've been kind of holding back the tides of depression is through debt and inflation. And so we've been kicking the can down the road, but we're really sowing the seeds of the future depression that I believe the time period we're in now will just be lumped in with it. This is the earlier stages of that prolonged period that is really going to coincide with having to come to terms with all the mistakes that we've made in the past. It's like the chickens coming home to roost because of bad monetary and fiscal policy that go back for decades. We're in a huge hole. It isn't going to be easy to get out of it. And the time period where we're going to get out of it, it's going to be hard times. And the government is in a position to make those times a lot harder. That's a wild card as to how the government is going to react to this unfolding crisis and how much worse they might make it be. Now, as far as hyperinflation, I was talking about a hyperinflation scenario back in the early days of the 2008 financial crisis based on the way the government reacted to that with quantitative easing. And I knew the road that we were going down could lead to hyperinflation. Now, I always said that that was a worst case scenario. I never said, hey, it's for sure. I still think that that hasn't been taken off the table. The odds of that are actually greater now than they were when I first started warning about it. But I always said that, look, that's the worst case scenario. You destroy your currency completely, where you're talking Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe. But what I did say was inevitable was very high inflation. And we've just started to experience that in recent years. And I don't think that's over. I mean, I think we're going to see higher inflation. Right now, the high watermark for year-over-year CPI was just over 9%. That's not going to cap this. We're going to go into the double digits. And the first digit might not be a 1. That still wouldn't be hyperinflation, right? If we have 20% inflation, that's not hyperinflation.
That's curl up in a fetal position and suck your thumb and cry yourself to sleep territory.
It's bad, but also if you compare what we have now, because everybody wants to say, look, it's not that bad because look how much worse it was in the 70s where we had inflation 10, 11, 12% for several years. What people don't understand is that you're comparing apples to oranges because the CPI that was in use in the 70s is not the same CPI that we use today.
What does it mean to quantitatively ease a situation? Why does that become problematic? And that is the most important seed that sows your destruction in terms of inflation.
When they print their way out of a short-term problem, they print their way into an even larger long-term problem, which is what they did. Now, quantitative easing is just a euphemism, better sounding name for something that's really bad, which is inflation. Quantitative easing is when the government prints money and buys government bonds. Now that's inflation by definition, by classic definition. Inflation is when you expand the supply of money. How is the money supply expanded? By the purchase of debt. The central bank buys government debt and creates the money to pay for it. That's the mechanism in the United States where the money supply grows. And so that's just inflation. When Ben Bernanke first launched quantitative easing in 2009 as a way to stimulate the economy, he really said, look, let's create a bunch of inflation to stimulate the economy. Now, he didn't want to say that because if he went out and told the public, our solution to this financial crisis is to create inflation, people would have said, but wait a minute, I don't want inflation. I don't want my cost of living to go up. That doesn't sound like a good solution. Is that all you got? You got something else? Basically, they dress it up and they say, no, what we're doing is quantitative easing. That doesn't sound so bad. That's how they got the public to swallow more inflation. The reason that we didn't get real big increases in the CPI until really after COVID was that there were a lot of forces in the economy at that time that were pushing prices down. And had the government not unleashed all this inflation, we would have seen prices fall. I mean, they never actually fell during any year. But had the government not done that, I'm pretty sure that prices would have gone down and the cost of living would have been lower. Now, a lot of these politicians or Keynesian economists say that's terrible. Oh, that's deflation. That's really a bad deal. We don't want that. That's BS. If prices go down, that is good for the consumer. That provides relief because now the cost of living is lower. You don't need as much money to buy food. You don't need as much money to buy energy. You have more money left over to buy other things. You don't have to go into debt to pay for things. And falling prices is even good for business. As long as their costs are falling in line with their prices, they maintain their margins and now they can sell more. They make it up on volume because when prices are lower, their customers can buy more stuff. So everybody wins from falling prices, but the government doesn't want that. It was able to stop that by unleashing inflation.
The government actually does want falling prices because they want to tax that falling price in the form of inflation. But if they don't have the falling prices, when they do inflation, people will really feel it. So for instance, if prices were actually going down by 2%, they inflate by 3%, they now get 5% inflation, but I only feel 3% of it. As the government, I'm able to really take advantage of those falling prices.
You hit the nail on the head, and I'm glad that you actually picked up on that. Inflation is a tax, and people just don't realize it because the government blames it on greedy corporations, on OPEC, on everybody but themselves. But it is a hidden tax, and the easiest way to hide it is if you have a productive economy that otherwise would reduce prices. Because if prices were going to go down, let's say by 5%, and they create 5% inflation so that prices remain the same, nobody realizes how much worse off they are because the government stole something they never had. The free market was going to deliver that benefit, and the government took it. See, what everybody has to understand is every dime that the government spends must be paid for by the public, one way or another. Now, the traditional way to pay for it is with taxes. The government wants to spend money on the military. They want to spend money on Social Security or Medicare or whatever they're doing. They need to collect taxes because the government doesn't have any real money because the government doesn't really produce anything. It only has the money it takes from the private sector, and then it takes that money from one person and gives it to somebody else. They have to take it first. Well, if they don't take it through taxation, how do they get it? They print it. They sell bonds to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve buys those bonds and puts money into the government's checking account, and then the government just spends that. But when the government spends that money, what it does is it reduces the value of the money that already exists. So everybody's paycheck is diminished in value. Everybody's savings are diminished because now prices go up because you have more money in the economy without new production to give that new money value. That increase in price that is a result of this deficit spending and money printing is basically a tax. But the people don't realize they've been taxed. So the politicians love it because they can pretend that the voter's getting something for nothing because the voter doesn't make the connection between the price hikes. And if the economy is really booming so that prices are dropping, you don't even notice the price hikes. But now the problem is we've created so much money, especially after COVID and all the money we printed there, which was, off the charts crazy during those years. We now have so much money in the pipeline. The economy is now being crippled by more regulation and other things that are making it less productive. We're seeing much greater upward pressure on prices. But I tried to make the point earlier is that we would have even seen more movement in the CPI earlier if it wasn't rigged. The CPI we had in the 70s is not the same CPI we have now because in the 1990s, they changed it all. They changed the methodology for computing price increases. Their goal was to have a lower CPI because they claimed that the CPI was overstating inflation, and so they decided to fix it. If you measured the prices that we saw, the increases, if you used the 1970s CPI and then took the prices that we were living through, they were double digit. I mean, we were probably the year that we had 9%, it was probably 18%. That was worse than any year of the 1970s or early 1980s. That's how bad it was. shadow stats. They've been doing that for a long time. When they changed that, back in the 70s, it was the same basket, and they just said, what did it cost last year, and what does all that exact same stuff cost this year? But now they don't do that. They change the basket. They take stuff out that's gone up. They put stuff in that didn't go up as much. They adjust it for so-called quality improvements. Oh, that's a much higher quality than the one you bought last year, so let's make the price go down. But it's subjective. Is it really better? And a lot of times the quality goes down. I don't think they ever subtract for falling quality. It's like a one-way street. They just assume everything is getting better, when in many cases, people are substituting lower quality ingredients or stuff that used to be included. A classic would be airline. People would buy an airline ticket. They got their seat. They could get food. They could get a pillow. They could get a blanket. They could carry on stuff. Now, all of a sudden, all that's extra. It's not part of the airfare anymore. You want to pick your own seat? That's extra. You want to check luggage? That's extra. You want a blanket? That costs more, right? All this stuff now are add-ons. That's not part of the CPI. If you look at some of the other measures, like where the government uses personal consumption expenditures, there you have lots of hedonics where they just basically say, oh, if steak gets too expensive, we'll just kick out steak and we'll put hamburger in there because we'll just assume people stop eating steak and they settle for hamburger. We can pretend that the price didn't go up. But the quality is going down. I want to eat steak. I can't afford it. And so I'm stuck with hamburger. And according to the government, that means there's no inflation. I mean, by that logic, if I have to give up hamburger and start eating dog food because I can't afford hamburger anymore, as far as the government's concerned, there's no problem because I'm still eating. But I don't like having to eat dog food. I'd rather eat people food. But this is how the whole thing is rigged. They're taxing us through inflation. Then they're lying to us about how bad it is. And the ultimate irony is all the years that the Fed was printing all this money, creating all this inflation, they were pointing to a rigged CPI that was less than 2%. And they said, we need it higher. We don't have enough inflation. And that was the justification for continuously creating more inflation because they theoretically said we need to get up to 2%, when in reality, we were already way above 2%. But there's nothing magical about 2%. 1% is better than 2%. If you have 1%, you don't try to get up to 2%. You try to go down to 0 or -1. Lower prices are better than rising prices. Only an idiot economist or a central banker, or maybe some of these Wall Street people, could believe that rising prices are good, or that prices that go up by 2% every year constitute price stability. That's not stability. That's a continuous increase in price. Stable means the prices don't change.
Why is it a fallacy to believe that if prices are going down, that people just turn into Scrooge McDuck, storing their money away and freezing up the economy?
First of all, the fact that we have an economy that is based on spending, that's the problem. That's part of the bubble. We have a bubble economy. A legitimate economy would not be based on spending. It would be based on savings and production. You don't have to encourage people to spend. Everybody wants to spend. I mean, that's how we ratify ourselves. We want things. Everybody wants stuff. And so everybody would spend. I mean, I have young kids. I mean, they would spend constantly if I didn't stop them. I mean, they don't need encouragement. I mean, I have a wife. I don't have to encourage her to spend. I got to do everything I can to stop it, right? So spending doesn't have to be encouraged, right? Because that's delayed gratification. Savings needs to be encouraged. Do without what you want. Don't have it right now. Wait, delay your gratification. So you need to encourage that. And the market does that with interest and other ways of rewarding people for saving. But when interest rates were at 0 and inflation was above 0, we were punishing people for saving. We were punishing people for doing exactly what they need to do. Because what makes a real economy grow is savings, because savings is what finances capital investment. Capital investment is what leads to increasing productivity and higher living standards. Everybody wants to buy. That just comes naturally. We all want stuff, so we don't need to encourage that. But the idea that if prices fall, that people will stop spending and therefore prices need to rise to encourage spending is pure BS. People are going to spend anyway, but they're actually more likely to spend if prices are going down than if prices are going up. And here's why. This nonsense. That if I think the price is going to go down, I'm just not going to buy it. I'm going to wait to get it cheaper. Therefore, no one's going to buy because we're all going to be sitting back waiting for a better deal. That is nonsense. People buy things when they want them. And the proof of that is all around us. Cell phones. The first cell phone was probably $2,000, $3,000 when you finally got a portable phone. And it was very expensive to use it. When I finally got my first cell phone, I never wanted to use it because it was too expensive. I would say, hey, call me on the weekend. I can't talk. I'm on my cell phone. It's too expensive, right? But the reason a lot of people didn't buy the first cell phones is because they were too expensive. They couldn't afford it. The reason everybody has cell phones now is because they're so cheap. The price going down is what motivated more people to buy. You buy things when you can afford them. And if you can't afford the current price, if the price just goes up, well, then you really can't afford it. The first television set probably cost the same as an automobile. Who bought the first television set? Some really rich guy. It was a novelty, but it was a gigantic piece of furniture with like a 2-inch screen and you probably had 2 channels and you had 2 or 3 hours a day where you could watch it. People bought televisions because they got cheaper. Now, people buy televisions all the time. Everybody knows if I buy a television today, a year from now, I could buy a better one for less money. Everybody knows that, but they buy them anyway. The same thing with a computer. Every piece of electronics that you buy, if you just don't buy it and buy it in a year or two, you'll get it cheaper. But people buy them anyway because they want to use them now. If you own a business and you really want to incentivize people to come in and shop, what do? You have a sale. You lower the price. Hey, I'm lowering the price, 10% off, 20% off. Now people, they want to shop. Like, why does everybody come to the stores on Black Friday? Because they lower the price, not because they raise the price. So it's just complete BS that people will stop spending if prices go down. No. They'll spend more because they can afford to buy more. They'll buy more stuff at lower prices. When you're talking about costs causing inflation. And the same thing as prices. Sometimes they say costs go up and that makes prices go up. They talk about the cost price push. But costs and prices are 2 words for the same thing. One person's cost is another person's price. If I'm a business and I have to buy steel, well, what's my steel cost? Well, the guy that's selling me steel, my cost is the price he charges me. It's his price. It's my cost. So prices and costs are really the same thing. Why are they going up? What's making them go up when a free market would make them come down? That is the beauty of capitalism, is it lowers costs.
How does it lower costs? Is it through innovation or is there another mechanism?
Yeah, through increasing productivity. I figure out cheaper ways to make stuff. You build a more productive mousetrap so that you can catch more mice for less money. The cost of producing a cell phone today is much lower than it was 20 years ago. That's the reason they're so much cheaper. The free market figured out a better way to produce. And they did that because the companies earn money from selling some very expensive cell phones. They take that money, they invest in research and development to figure out more efficient ways to produce. And of course, as they produce more at lower prices, they also create economies of scale. That is the natural tendency of a market-based economy. If you look at the US, if you look at the CPI in 1900, and then you look at it in 1800, 100 years earlier, prices are down about 50%. Prices are half that they were in 1800. The market cut cost of living in half. We were on a gold standard for most of that time period, other than a few years of the Civil War, where we really started printing money. But in that economy, prices went down. Now, with technology, we should actually be enjoying even faster price declines in this century than they had in the 19th century. The reason we've been robbed of those benefits is because of government. And of course, there is a lot more regulation now. The markets are not as free as they used to be, and therefore they're not as efficient as they used to be. And therefore prices aren't going down as much as they would if the government got out of the way and allowed entrepreneurs to be more effective. Instead of having to waste resources and time on government red tape, they could have devoted those resources to becoming more productive. But there was another reason too that they were able to keep the inflation rate low is we outsourced all of our production to China. We had all these Chinese workers that would do the work for a fraction of what Americans would in factories that didn't have to deal with all the regulations of American factories. And so we got all this stuff coming in from China that helped keep prices down. But the flip side of that was we lost a lot of good paying jobs and we ran massive trade deficits. Now we have to deal with that problem that we created trying to kick the can down the road, because you're right about politicians and their time horizon. They can only see as far as their own reelection, which in America, in many cases, is 2 years. People want something for nothing. That is the inherent flaw of a democracy. That's why the founding fathers established America as a republic, not a democracy, and they tried to protect the country from the evil forces of democracy, which they referred to as mobocracy. So we're not supposed to be a democracy for the very reasons that democracies create the type of problems that we now have. Everything that you're happy the government did was a mistake. Now, the reason you're happy they did it was because of the short-term benefit of that mistake. But you don't perceive the actual long-term consequences of doing that. Let's say you're a football player, you're in a game, you injure your ankle, and the coach is like, look, let me shoot you up with this so you can keep on playing because we want you in the game. And so he shoots you up with this medicine and you don't feel the pain, and so you keep running on your foot, and you're able to finish that game. But because you did that, you screwed up your foot so bad, you're out for the rest of the season. They were just thinking about one game, and so you ran on a foot that you shouldn't have run on. You got numb to the pain, and your body was like, hey, don't run on me, go rest. That's what the government does. They try to make us numb to the pain, and then we end up doing more damage. And so what happened after COVID, that policy was horrific. And bailing out the banks, both in 2008 and now again with the bank bailouts we've had this year, all this is a mistake. The politicians want to get reelected, right? They just want to win this game. They don't care about the season. It's this game. And so they're just doing whatever they can to numb us all to the pain. There's a saying, you talk about a free lunch, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's because somebody's got to pay for that lunch. So if it's free to you, the question is, who's paying for it? Because the food didn't just magically appear. There is a cost. The government can print money, but it can't print stuff. The stuff has to be made. And that's why when you print money without any stuff being made, all that happens is the price of that stuff goes up. Because if we could just print money and people could buy stuff, everybody would be rich. We just print up a bunch of money. Why not give everybody millions of dollars and we all be rich, right? No, the price of everything would just go up. Nobody would be rich. The only way we can all be richer is if we all produce more. Printing more money doesn't change anything. You're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You need a more stable boat. So we need to make more stuff. That's how we can satisfy more demand, is by creating more supply. If we just print money, we increase demand, supply is the same. Prices go up. That's the inflation. But yes, what we were able to do is we were able to con the whole world, the Chinese and a lot of other people, into taking the paper that we print for the stuff they produce, because the dollar is the reserve currency. So instead of actually having to make stuff that the Chinese wanted, we just printed money and said, hey, take this. And now they took all this stuff that they made in factories. They actually had to invest in them, and people had to do hard work, and maybe they were making pollution, whatever. But the Chinese economy expended real resources to produce all kinds of goods that are filling up the shelves in Walmart that Americans are driving home in their big SUVs. And what are they doing? How are we earning all this stuff? The Fed's just printing money and handing it out. What does that cost us? Next to nothing. In the short run, this is a great deal for Americans because we get something for nothing, and the Chinese get nothing for something, except they don't realize they're getting nothing. They think this paper has a lot of value. In reality, it doesn't, because it's an IOU. It's a claim on U.S. production. But what if our production is going down? Eventually, we're going to wipe all that out with massive inflation when the world doesn't want our dollars anymore, and they try to cash them in. When they try to buy stuff, it's like, well, what are you going to buy? We don't have our factories anymore. They're all in China. That money's no good. I mean, we run this giant Ponzi scheme. We have a $33 trillion national debt that continues to grow trillions of dollars a year. And we finance it like Bernie Madoff did, because we can't pay anybody back. So whenever a bond matures, we find some other sucker to buy it. And when we have to pay our interest, we find suckers to loan us that money too. But this only continues as long as the suckers are willing to keep lending. But when people want their money back, we don't have it. During the debt crisis, we even admitted that we said if we can't go deeper into debt, we're going to default because we're broke. So all this is going to collapse. The dollar is going to lose its reserve currency status. And then if Americans want to consume, they're going to have to produce. And that's much harder than printing. And that's going to mean a lot of people who are not productive are going to have to start working. And a lot of people who have jobs, they have non-productive jobs. Those jobs aren't going to cut it in a society where we're no longer creating the reserve currency. They're going to have to go make something.